I'm Jan MacArthur from the Department of Educational Research, and it's one of the joys of my job that I am the PhD supervisor of Priscilla Echeverria. I probably still can't say it correctly, Priscilla. She's doing some amazing work. She's been here as a member of our department as a doctoral student for 3 years. And so before I get to her talk, I just have to tell you a few formalities I've just remembered. So I need to tell everyone that this seminar is being live streamed for postgraduate student staff and other interested people, and they can ask questions at the presentation, at the end of the presentation, or via the chat box. The session is recorded and the recording will be available on the department website. Can I ask that during the presentation, you please keep your camera off and stay on mute. So that's all I have to say to start with. So as I said, it's my pleasure to introduce Priscilla, who's from Chile and has some really interesting insights into novice teachers and how or if they develop a sense of their social justice role. So I think I'll pass over to Priscilla now.
Thank you very much, Jan. And thank you for the department for this invitation. I feel honored to be here. And thank you for all the assistants for the interest to see this presentation, which is called the Pedagogical Agency Capacity in Novice Teachers, the responsibility of initial teacher formation programs from a critical perspective. This seminar is about, as the poster said, about the value of an integral perspective of education as an opposite to a technocratic one. This seminar addresses initial teacher formation as a crucial and formative space to restore a perspective of how a critical education can look like when serves to social justice. For that, this seminar discusses the need for initial teacher formation programs to assume a responsibility, enabling pedagogy students with agency capacities to deal with a technocratic school culture that empties education of meaning and makes them become bureaucrats, and in turn be able to relate to their future students to promote the development of their own agency capacities, contributing to develop more democratic societies. For the presentation, the structure of the presentation is to offer a discussion of these previous concepts that are part of the theoretical framework, and then a preview of the first results obtained from the analysis. A very little small part, because actually I'm doing the analysis, so I have processed part of the information collected. The first important thing is to make the distinction between an integral perspective of education versus a technocratic one. An integral perspective of education, according to this research, the position of this research is that education is an integral process. An integral because considers our human condition in its indivisible complexity of multiple dimensions, as a formation because it is a process in constant development and progression. And this is related to Hegel's concept of Bildung, which is connected to the idea of ethics as obtained freedom, as freedom is not something given, but something must be conquered. From this perspective, education implies that a person must both to appropriate the given conditions of the society, right, norms, institutional orders, and culture of its time, and to recreate it and renew them. So formation, it is a dialectic and an intersubjective process. On the opposite, a technocratic perspective of education and pedagogy is based on a search of a type of rationality in the way of acting pedagogically consistent with a utilitarian vision of teaching, educational institutions, and education in general. This is based in a Taylorist form of understanding processes in the industry, which has utilitarian roots, valuing efficiency and performance. This puts everything implied in process as means to reach goals or objectives, people included. The problem when this logic is taken to education is that supposes neutrality and objectivity of the processes, and makes arise a tension between moral and instrumental aspects of education, because persons are reduced to the condition of objects, dehumanizing them. Individual turned into means for others' ends, objects, or as would Hannah Arendt said, bureaucrats. These two logics can be read from the initial teacher perspective, initial teacher formation processes perspective. So let's see first, what does it mean, initial teacher formation as a technical training space? There are some alerts from the theory. The first one, qualitative aspects of formation that should be valued for their contribution to the formation of a more just, ethically healthier, and politically more democratic society have been neglected. Many initial teacher formation programs have reduced the meaning of pedagogy to methodology, favoring the formation of a technical professional over a reflective or critical one. In the case of secondary teachers, for example, it is as if a secondary teacher was the result of to be an expert of the discipline or their subject and the methodology and anything else. So it is very worrying to see that a teacher is reduced just to these two fields or dimensions. The restitution of the subject is an urgent task in teacher formation, so it is essential to empower them in their capacity for action. The first question that we can do in this scenario is, do graduate teachers have the capacity to act and make decisions, putting the formative purposes that they are capable of defining autonomously before technical or bureaucratic issues imposed by the curriculum or the official culture? Okay, let's see now initial teacher formation from a critical perspective. Maybe the most common issue about or critique about this technical perspective is the lack of reflection. There are some recommendations from the literature. Maybe the most classic one is that initial teacher formation is a place where future teachers arrive with pre-established beliefs about their future role, because all of them have already had experience of 12 years in the school system. So these beliefs are important because they will impact in the type of teacher they will be. So it is important to develop reflection capacities to unpack and review those beliefs. This is very, very important, and reflection is very, very important, but from a critical perspective, it's not enough. It's not enough for a more egalitarian and liberating practice, as reflection can be reduced as a form of liberalism when it doesn't consider the social and historical dimensions in which the practice, the pedagogical practice, is inscribed. So a critical perspective goes beyond. It is necessary to problematize initial teacher formation itself as a starting point for the reproduction of a technocratic logic. So it is important that we consider some keywords, a new language in order to refer to initial teacher formation. For example, dialogical interaction, implication of the subjects that are learning, participation, power dynamics, consideration of the experience of the subjects to assign shared meanings to knowledge, subjectivity, and so on. So it is very important to understand their future place of working, school culture as problematic, and the institution as a political space. School culture and school institutions are not neutral. It is very important that future teachers understand that the place for teaching and learning is not a neutral space, that it is full of tensions because there are different interests implied in them. So there will be tensions between the limits and the possibilities in their teaching practice. So it is important that this future teacher can learn to understand this political space, these different tensions, and to see what are the limits for their teaching practice and what are their possibilities. What I'm saying is that initial teacher formation is not only an academic process, but a socialization process. This study positions from a Bourdieusian perspective, so considers that this reproduction of inequality lies in the interactions between the individuals implies in educational processes, which favor the development of a certain habitus in the individuals. This is, as Bourdieu says, certain dispositions or schemes of acting, thinking, and feeling associated with social position. This habitus, even though it's individual, is built in processes of socialization. For instance, in the case of individuals placed in an unfavored position in the school, in initial teacher formation, right, need to overcome their disadvantaged position. For this, it requires certain ways of interaction to strengthen in them dispositions that favor their flourishing. On the other hand, in the case of individuals placed in the privileged position in society, it's required to strengthen ways of interactions that overcome control and dominance. All said, socialization processes developed in education must consider the quality of interaction as the center of its work. For this, it is crucial that teachers learn to interact with their students to help them to empower themselves, which requires to overcome technical perspectives of teaching. This is centered on control and dominance, to develop dialogic ways that recognize, validate, include, and empower others. Um, we have many concepts implied in this research and in this discussion, but I will present just three of them. The first one is social justice. What is the relation between critical education and social justice? Critical theory, by offering a criterion of domination, helps us to understand that injustice is generated by a form to relate to the world, oriented by an instrumental rationality, the technocratic perspective of education discussed before, which has naturalized relating to things and also human beings as resources or being friends, generating a culture of dehumanization by dominating conscience and freedom of agency. So there are two authors from critical theory that are very valuable to help us to make this link between critical education and social justice. The first one is Iris Young, who understands social justice as lack of institutionalized oppression, and Axel Honneth, who understands social justice as proper recognition. These both terms, oppression and recognition, are implied in human interaction. So taking them to pedagogical interaction could be a way to make visible how critical education for social justice could look like. So the key thing here is to keep an eye on how we manage power when we relate to others. How we, teachers, manage power when we relate to others, not only in the school to empower kids or teenagers, but in initial teacher formation, because there we can model these ways of interaction, right? Maybe the problem in initial teacher formation, when says it is for social justice or for critical pedagogy, is that there is a lot of discourse about it, rhetoric, right? But what I'm saying here is that critical education for social justice, it is or it goes through the quality of the interaction we propose others, because in this interaction is how power balance, right, between each other. The other concepts I want to present you are pedagogical agency and pedagogical interaction. According to Bauman, Sigmund Bauman, the Polish sociology, agency is the ability to influence the circumstances of one's life and formulate the meaning of the common good through collective power. According to Akram, agency has a dialectical notion because incorporates Bourdieu's notion of habitus. As we said before, the habitus is socially acquired and culturally incorporated and reflects the social construction of reality in which they are inscribed in our cognitive structures, even unconscious. Finally, pedagogical agency can be understood as a capacity of action. When Hannah Arendt said that the opposite of a human is a bureaucrat, what she was saying is that a person without capacity of action is not a human being because it hasn't developed that make him or make her a human. The capacity to think the world, to act in it, which involves three dimensions according to Dalmia: the political, the ethical, and the epistemic. On the other hand, we have pedagogical interaction, which is very important, as I explained before, because it is related to how we act in the world. It is very important of developing a capacity of instrumental interaction, so able of including themselves and others. And education for social justice then should put human interaction into the realm of education, a dialogical way of interaction that treats us as subjects, not objects, not bureaucrats, to develop agency, to develop our capacity to take initiative, to provoke changes. So, as a for closing this section, how does social justice materialize in the classroom context from this perspective? It is important that initial teacher formation develop sensitivity and educate the YAs to identify oppression and take action against it, both to be a subject capable of acting and to allow its students to do so. When I say develop sensitivity and educate the gaze to identify oppression, I'm talking about be able to see our own way of interact with others with less power as students in the classroom, to keep a vigilance, right, of how we are offering an experience of power to others. All right, there are three very important elements here. The first thing, putting the quality of human interaction as the center of pedagogical practice, because from the interaction, much more is taught than one is believed to be taught, because it contains implicit messages, implicit meanings. Pedagogical interactions represent an opportunity to overcome instrumental rationality and avoid the injustice of oppression by encouraging empowerment in students. These interactions are plenty of subtle but pervasive exercises of power relations, and it is full of implicit messages or a hidden curriculum. The second important thing to materialize in the classroom context is to make visible the importance of being responsible with the exercise of power that is offered from the pedagogical task as an authority, both in the field of human interaction and in the relationship with knowledge, which is the key to contributing to a more just society. And finally, understanding that an interaction according to a liberating impetus develops a dialogical, reflective, and democratic pedagogy, open to uncertainty and creativity, which understands authority as a moral bond developed in the commitment to the other. Unfortunately, and this is the major tension that this research faces, the workplace of these future teachers doesn't help to develop this kind of pedagogy. The Chilean school system is a system that have strengthened managerial management with mechanisms such as standardized census type evaluations, result-based management, and competition between schools, which have implied some consequences a curriculum and assessment policy in Chile increasingly standardized and prescriptive, which has impacted in teachers' work as it has become an obstacle to the exercise of autonomous, flexible, contextualized, and active teaching, impacting on school daily life. This condition limits the pedagogical action field and predefines the type of teacher desired by the system, which is not this reflective and critical teacher we have discussed here. This standardization responds to a neoliberal political rationality based mainly on the cultural homogenization of the different educational systems due to the imposition of achievement levels in certain areas of knowledge that are prioritized. And this standardization translates into prescriptions of the pedagogical daily work of teachers, which, as teachers themselves indicate, turn out to be an important limitation in the generation and development of links with students, both in the field of knowledge and in the emotional dimension. So what I'm saying here is that the context of work is very, very difficult. Pushes you to be a technocratic teacher. And what I'm saying is that initial teacher formation should empower future teachers to deal with this technocratic logic with the ability to recognize it and to recognize limits. Yes, of course, all this context is a huge limit, but also possibilities in order to face this technocratic culture with a more humanizing one. For that, my research, the main question of my research is, what is the agency capacity that novice teachers develop in their initial teacher formation? This pedagogical agency capacity is this capacity that teachers could develop in order to resist, to face this technocratic culture. The main goal or the main objective for my research is to analyze the capacity of pedagogical agency that teachers have developed upon completion of their initial teacher formation, to propose guidelines that redirect efforts to recover an integral human dimension of secondary education formation to contribute to social justice. This research focuses in general on the role that initial teacher formation plays in contributing to social justice when it is understood, as we explained before, as a pedagogical practice based on the recognition of others and on eliminating institutionalized oppression. This study seeks to open a discussion that makes visible the importance of preparing future teachers is something inevitable in the pedagogical exercise, the use of responsible power through the interactions they develop with their students so that these are formative, humanizing. Also make visible the crucial role, and this is very, very important in my research, make visible the role that university pedagogy programs plays in the transformation of the pedagogical practice of future teachers, since it is the channel of a hidden curriculum that configures political subjectivities. As you can see, there is a value given to emancipation in this study, which lies in recognizing that in pedagogical interaction, there is a situation of power. And forming teachers to take charge of the responsible use of the power is a minimum to advance in the development of more democratic communities. The general methodological scope of my research it is obviously a critical inquiry, in-depth qualitative inductive analysis. The analysis of these studies based on the exploration of information provided by graduated professors, directors, and international, this is in Spanish, initial teacher formation programs of universities that declare to have a social commitment. There, as data collection instrument, I have documentation of initial teacher formation programs, interviews with novice teachers, and critical incidents collected from these novice teachers. There are I have 7 initial teacher formation programs with a minimum of 2 participants each. The information I will present now is just focused on the analysis of one instrument to answer one specific question. In my research, I have 7 specific questions, and one of them, the question number 2, is what is the capacity of ethical, political, epistemic, pedagogical agency that novice teachers show in their first professional experiences as teachers? In order to answer this question, I have used an instrument called critical incidents, because to see the capacity of pedagogical agency is not possible in the discourse. It's not something you can verbalize. Maybe you can identify some interesting elements, but the most important or the most appropriate way to see it is in action. So these critical incidents are narratives written by these novice teachers. I asked them to relate some situations in which they have felt be dealing with power, be dealing with tensions, be dealing with different interests, right? Between them and the students or the teachers or directors or parents, families in the school, not matter the actor. The thing is, for me, the thing is how they solve these tensions, how they put their knowledge, their convictions, their desires as teachers, as novice teachers in this scenario, in this political scenario, right? So, as I said before, the critical incidents are being chosen because the capacity for pedagogical agency is not necessarily at a conscious level. The instrument for collecting information that consists of narratives about unforeseen situations which instantly illuminate some key problematic aspect of the teacher's role, as Wood says, who is an author that writes and said a lot about narratives. To facilitate the first analysis, we have used the literature of agency capacity, which suggests that this capacity has a political, ethical, and epistemic dimension. I will not read this. It's just to let you know that these dimensions, political, ethical, and epistemic, is related to aspects or different dimensions that can be identified in this agency. I made a compilation of different um, sorry, different ideas, different criteria, different categories, right, to identify political, ethical, and epistemic. So when I read this episode, I tried to identify these dimensions to see the presence or absence of these different elements in order to read this critical incident in a critical way. For example, the first category of political dimension, capacity of going beyond the instrumental, attempt for breaking the condition of bureaucrats. Is this reflected in the incident? Is this part of the problem related in the incident? How did the novice teacher solve this or face this? In terms of ethical dimension, for example, capacity of relating to others beyond the instrumental, again, the capacity of promoting a dialogical relationship in which teachers encourage students to become someone recognized. Okay, is there dialogue in the way in which this novice teacher faced the situation with the students, for example, right? And the same with the epistemic. Okay, let's see now. I will present now two narratives, two critical incidents developed by two different novice teachers. These critical incidents will be presented. And then I will present part of the analysis I have developed for them. The idea in my research is to analyze them all, and finally, to make some conclusions of the group of critical incidents, but also in a separate way, because there are some very interesting differences between some teachers. All right, the critical incident number 1 is given by a novice teacher called Lorena. I call her like Lorena. She is obviously female, a teacher of musical arts. She is in her first year of working experience after studying 5-year initial teacher program. The context is, I worked as a music teacher in a small high-class paid private school. The courses were for few students, maximum 25 boys and girls. And from the beginning, I was told that inclusion was an important task for the institution, for which they accepted children who came from other countries and who had suffered bullying in other schools. Basically, they had omitted important information regarding that topic. Many children with severe untreated special educational needs, and the school didn't take care, so I was forced to have to deal with them on my own because there was no support for teachers. The episode is this. She called it a playgroup chaos. At the end of recess, I tried to start my class in kindergarten. I tried, but I couldn't because was a lot of noise and the environment was complex. As soon as I entered, they were already starting to fight. A small group of children hit each other between cries of real warfare, while a chair at a table flew violently into the air, while another child climbed up the furniture on the wall, and the co-educator went out on her way to try to lower him. Panicked, without no success, while another little boy threw all my things on the floor in a sudden fit of rage. I remember looking at the scene desperately, not knowing where to start to stop the chaos. Again, it wasn't the first time the class had turned into a jungle. The inspector had to come to put order, taking away the children who caused the most problems. So I was able to continue with about 2/3 of the course. I was able to take classes, but with a bitter taste for not having been able to take charge of the situation. What I can see in this episode, according to this political, ethical, and epistemic elements, right, that are part of a pedagogical agency. Okay, some preliminary findings. Lorena doesn't seem to attend to deeper questions, such as the conditions in which children find themselves, which she poses as negative when she describes the context, but which, however, she seems to ignore when presenting her class. On the one hand, he seems to recognize that children are trapped by the context, and on the other, she seems to see no other alternative than for children to adapt and come down to do their class. She claims that she doesn't have help to normalize the situation, which says a lot about the lack of pedagogical resources, that she has to imagine possible ways to face her difficulties. We have to remember that this is a reception group. We are talking about 6 or 7-year-old children. In terms of political aspects, Lorena seems not to be able to think about different ways to develop her class to challenge the order of things. She doesn't seem to be able to read the reaction of children as a way of resistance of the system they are, as they are so young that are not normalized by the system yet. She's centered in a technical rationality, worrying in control. This is how solve the problem instead of communicative one that wonders about the reasons underlying the roots of the problem. As political aspects have to do with the capacity of visualizing issues of power and interest that there are at schools, Lorena seems not Lorena seems to naturalize a unique way to develop her work as a teacher. Even though the narrative is about a difficult situation, in her later reflection in the interview doesn't appear any thought about different ways to imagine school and teaching, as if the only problem were the children that misbehave. Even though she seems to be aware of the lack of sense of being at school, at the same time, paradoxically, she expects the children, kindergarten children, behave as normalized students. In terms of ethical aspects, Lorena seems not to be able to start a dialogue with the students, even though they are very young. When I refer to dialogue, I refer to interact in such a way, in a more playful way, for instance, to create conditions to develop a welcoming meeting, a shared atmosphere to learn together. In epistemic terms, Lorena reveals weaknesses also, as if the degree of awareness or reflection regarding what is known was not deep. She doesn't go to her own beliefs to explore where the problem could be or how to find possible ways to face the situation. So this is my preliminary reading in a critical way of this first episode. Let's see the second and last one. This incident is given by a male teacher of mathematics in his first year of working experience after studying 5-year initial teacher program. I call this teacher Manuel, and the context and the episode that follow were written by him. The context of the school was a humanistic, scientific, and professional technical secondary school placed in a very vulnerable area of Santiago, the capital of Chile. The episode, he has titled it Worries. I had to learn important places of the school, inspectorate, infirmary, names of my classmates and people in charge of each area, certain routines that the school demanded, fingerprint marking for attendance, requesting a key of the classroom from the assistant, a language of the school used in each mail, such as PJ, EA, SD, PIA, EC, among others. Quickly learned to use a system called Syscode, digital classwork, which I hadn't known before, in which I had to record attendance, grades, interviews, etc. All these previous actions, at least during the first 2 weeks of classes, made me feel stressed to such a level that at night I couldn't fall asleep. This was because I dreamed of all the tasks and activities that I had to do the next day without trying to make mistakes. Fortunately, I had the support of my colleagues who accompanied me in this process of difficult adaptation to school, where everything that was requested urgently. Now I feel grateful to the work team who helped me with tips and tools to get ahead in this initial stage. The reading I made of this first narrative offered by this mathematics teacher is that Manuel is very blunt and brief to describe and refer to the context in which he works. Even though I insisted in tell more about how was the school, it seems that everything related to qualitative or subjective aspects of the school culture was invisible to him, then only referred to descriptive and objective data, such as the type of education the school provides, level of education, place in the city of the school, number of students, etc. In relation to the episode, it was difficult to Manuel to describe extensively again, although I insisted reviewing the details of what he told in his writing during the interview. Sorry, I didn't mention that after the writings of the episodes, I interviewed these novice teachers just about the episode in order to solve any doubt or to clarify any information given by them. So in this interview, I insisted him to provide new information, trying to problematize something, but didn't provide new elements to the story. He can see that the situation is very simple. It is at the stage of worries derived from what he was living in the school in the period. He was getting used to his new work. Even though it is relevant to feel worried with this new situation, as it reflects he feels responsible, the reasons he gives are just limited to administrative issues. To learn the location of certain key places in the school, learn how to register his attendance, or learn some abbreviations and acronyms. It is interesting that someone without pedagogical experience doesn't mention anything about pedagogical issues. Neither does it in other episodes provided by him, nor in the rest of the interview. Other aspect of the narrative is that he says he could face the situation successfully thanks to the help of his colleagues, as they provided to him tips to solve practical urgent tasks to fulfill. Again, it is possible to observe that the things he highlights as problematic in his work as a teacher are restricted to fulfill with administrative issues. I'm not saying that to be supported by a colleague was not important, but it is interesting that among many different situations a teacher can live in their first experiences, the thing that is accentuated is something that is not specifically related to a pedagogical work. In the final question, he reinforces the invisibility of deeper aspects of pedagogical work and doesn't mention other aspects of his work there. Throughout the whole narrative, it can be observed that the school reality is something very unproblematic, as if the elements he is able to observe are restricted to good relationships. So, and in order to close my presentation, I will offer some general observations from this 2 episodes. We can see that these novice teachers are focused on institutional requirements. All the tensions that appear in these episodes are focused on institutional requirements for them. And they make an emphasis on compliance with administrative issues. We can see in these narratives a search for adaptation of themselves and students, which is worrying for me, is the absence of questioning structural issues that may cause the problem in and out of the institution. There is an invisibilization of pedagogical or formative issues. This integral perspective of education that I discussed at the beginning of my presentation, right, as a contrast of technocratic education, I can't see in these episodes formative issues, pedagogical issues from an integral perspective. And it is an absence of referring to the students as subjects. In the story, they appear as a unit without individualities to which to appeal. For example, when the music teacher refers to this boy that is climbing, right, the furniture in the classroom, she didn't refer to him by his name, or saying, for example, oh, again, he did it and he has a lot of problems. I don't know what to do with him. I don't know, in a more personalized way. There is an absence of this. In the case of the mathematics teacher, he even didn't refer to his students, sorry. All right, so what can we see in focusing on what this research is looking for and this instrument is looking for to answer the question number 2, which is to describe the pedagogical agency capacity developed in initial teacher formation in novice teachers. We can see a weak agency capacity and a weak capacity for interest in the transformation or empowerment of subjects. So my question remains, what kind of teachers is being trained at the initial teacher formation, and what type of person and society does it favor? There's some of the bibliography used in this study. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. That was an excellent talk. You led us through some complex material in a very clear and helpful way. Lots of good things here in the chat. So I'd like to, if people have questions, you can raise your hand with the little hand function or pop it in the chat. Will we move to show everyone now? Nice to get back together for a talk. I don't know who's in charge of the slide.
Priscilla, do you want to stop sharing your slides? Then we can, I think everyone will come on.
Priscilla's maybe having a well-earned rest. So Priscilla, are you still there?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Can you see me?
Great. Yes, yes.
Yes. Okay.
And, hopefully we can see all each other now. So that's nice. That's nice to be able to see some people. So what an interesting talk. I think you can see what a in-depth journey Priscilla has taken me on these past few years. So I've got things to ask, but I'll open it to the floor first. Oh well, I'll abuse my position, or that's what you're always meant to say, isn't it? But I'll ask the question, because one of the things that interests me about this work is that when I work with students, I often say to them, don't have too many influences, don't have too many theoretical influences, don't be torn in too many ways. And yet I think your work is a really nice demonstration of how to use complementary theorists. So when I think about the use of Honneth, who, even though his work extends beyond this, it very much starts at the person, you know, recognition of just their basic humanity. And I think Iris Young's work is a nice complement because it starts at that level of the institutional dominance. So I just wondered whether you could share anything about any issues you found trying to work with so many theorists, and maybe some advice for some of the other people here who are still doing their research.
Mm. Mm. I think that for me, it's very necessary to do this because the starting point to learn, from my perspective, I'm convinced that the starting point is always something that comes from your inner self, that is very connected with your deep concerns, which are connected with, of course, intellectual and emotional things. So when you try to understand a problem, understand an issue, I try to look for those theorists that offers some answer, even though it's a small answer, but I can connect with others in order to help me that this issue, that this concern makes sense for me. So it is impossible for me just to focus on one or two theorists. I think that a problem can be understood from many perspectives. So some years ago in my MA research, I learned that learning is a personal and group seeking, right? And this seeking implies that you have to be open to how can I say this? To collect as many voices as help you to understand things. And when you start to meet a web of knowledge, if it is coherent, it is consistent between them, all of them can be there. That's it.
Thank you. I think that's a really good explanation, really helpful. So we have a question here from Karen. Do you want to ask it, Karen? Do you want to?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I'm having some issues.
Hi, Karen.
I'm in a different office today. I just wanted to ask you, Priscilla, thank you very much. It's a really interesting talk and an area I'm really interested in. Do you think that your teachers, when they start teaching, get trusted by their schools? And do you think that affects their level of agency? Do you think that the schools trust them, or do you think that the teachers trust them to do a good job when they first start? Do you think that affects their agency?
It is complex to answer that because I think that can be a trust in terms of they are well prepared to respond to the expectations of the school. Expectations, is it right, that word, right? Expectations of the school. So what if this teacher is really eager for experimenting different things out of the technical logic of the school? Maybe this trust will not be so strong, right? Because you are a suspicious person when you try to do new things or when you disagree, right? So I think that in this technocratic culture that schools develop and initial teacher formation programs develop, they trust as you respond to the expected role assigned to you. And I think that is the problem, because this technocratic culture is developed by directors, right? By people in charge of the school that promote this vertical, not dialogic way of making decisions in the school. I think that we can grow up together if we feel implied in the processes we are part. But unfortunately, in this vertical culture, it's not possible to develop that. So I don't know. I think that's when initial teacher formation form teachers to be part of an institution of these characteristics. There are many teachers that adjust very well, but this adjustment is not necessarily to be well with the role. It is not have the tools to do different things. And an educator, that's not an educator from my point of view. It's just a trained employee to teach something, right? It is a very limited perspective of what a teacher should be.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I almost wonder if you're saying they don't trust any teachers by having this really strict sort of system.
Sorry, I didn't understand. I didn't listen.
I said that's a great answer, and it almost sounds like you're saying that the system doesn't trust anybody and they've got to keep them in this little box. So yeah, thank you for your answer.
Yes, the little box.
Great. Well, we've got Sally, and then we've got a couple of questions in the chat.
Hi, Priscilla. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I was a teacher educator myself, a teacher trainer myself, so I was really interested in some of your observations about the student teachers. And I worked in further education in England, which is a really credentialist, technocratic culture, I think it's fair to say. And I was wondering, to what extent you think that, I don't know what to call it really, but the shock of going into the classroom and the shock, because I think neophyte teachers experience a lot of shock. There's the physical shock of being in the college or the school environment and just all the bodies, but also there's the shock of managing behavior and so on and so forth. And one of the things I used to wonder about was, you know, I would be sometimes frustrated by the fact that new teachers were not very reflective, or if they were being asked to be reflective, they were very quite technocratic about it. They would kind of go through a list of things that they had to sort of reflect on. And I often used to think they need longer really in the classroom, and they need longer and to become more experienced, to be able to start to consider some of these questions of power and the political questions that you talked about in your talk. And I just wonder, do you think that that sort of shock gets in the way as well? Or what do you think it is that prevents it?
Sorry. Can you please repeat me just the question?
Yes. Yes. Do you think that the shock that young, well, they're not always young, but new teachers experience when they go into the classroom, do you think that that is a barrier to becoming more reflective, to becoming more critical about power and the situation that their students and the school system or the college system that they might find themselves in? I suppose I'm sort of looking at it from a sympathetic point of view and what do you think?
Well, I think that this is related to how we design initial teacher formation programs to help new teachers to be inserted in the system in a more accompanied way, because definitely it's not theory and then practice. That's not the right model, right? It's theory and practice in a continuum. And the place you can reflect about things that happen in school is university and the school. Unfortunately, the school, the rhythm of the school, doesn't help to develop a reflection about what happened there. On contrary, it's a kind of naturalization of what happened there, and you just have to apply tips to deal with the situation very quickly and go on, right? So I think that the shock of new teachers can be a barrier. And indeed, in my country, in Chile, 40% of the teachers leave the profession before the 5th year teaching, and that's a problem. But that is a problem because maybe the school is, not just for novice teacher, for everybody, a very shocking space if it is not a human space to be in, right? So I think that reflections about how power deals in school and how we are limited, but also we can be empowered to do things together, right? This is not about to say to be against others, against chiefs. It's not about that. This is about how can we identify spaces to do things together and to make school a more human place, which should be the purpose of education, right? So to answer your question, I think that shock is a very, very common thing, but we can deal with shock with accompanied activities with people that help others to reflect together to understand this complex phenomenon that school is.
Thank you very much. I think that there is a lot of value in what you say, and I think one of the things that I used to be guilty of teaching young teachers sometimes was just how to comply with some of the systems strategically in order to survive, because they have to survive. They're not going to get past that 5th year, or in Chile or wherever it is, unless they learn to survive those systems. But at the same time, doing that kind of does hamper some of the agency and some of the criticality. You might be thinking it, but yeah, they haven't always got the space to think it, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, just before we move on to the next question, what keeps coming up in my mind with the discussion so far is that, of course, all these teachers are themselves a product of the school system that Priscilla is wanting to change. And it is that perennial problem of changing an unjust system from within an unjust, from an unjust place. where do you get traction? So thanks, Sally. We've got a great question here from Camilla. Camilla, do you want to read it? Do you want to ask it, or do you want me to?
Hi. Hi, Priscilla. How are you? I really
Hi.
like this topic, like educational model that we dream, like with
We see.
perspective of social justice and critical education in another country. Like, sorry?
No, that's okay. No, the sound is coming in and out. So thanks, Camilla. I think we heard most of it, but just for people in the chat there, Camilla's asking about whether, Priscilla's considered other sorts of educational systems, and is there a country that sort of is closer to this perspective of social justice and critical education?
Okay. So make a choice of another country that is close to the perspective of social justice and critical education. Wow, what a good question. Thank you for your question, Camila. To be honest, I really don't know. I'm not a scholar that have studied other educational systems, because my kind of research is focused on the micropolitical aspect of education, which is what happens in the classroom, in the pedagogical interaction. I believe that any change can start there, even though top-down policies are very necessary and very important. I think that finally, what you offer to others is what they bring with them. So I haven't studied other educational system or country closer to this perspective. I only think that in a neoliberal world in which we live, in the Occidental world, I really don't know if there's another one.
Maybe it's worth opening that question up to the whole group, because Camilla, it really is intriguing. And does anyone have experience, or even just have an inkling, a feeling of a place where we wouldn't be pushing up? I think it's about a place where we wouldn't have to push so hard uphill is the idea. Anyone want to nominate? Yeah, Karen, please. Oh, we can't hear you. Sorry, just unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thanks.
Oh, brilliant. So I'm having sound issues as well. Yeah, I mean, like Sally, I do initial teacher education in the UK, but also I'm still a serving assistant head in the UK, and we are. When you read the literature, it looks like we're more liberal. So the right noises are made. And we talk a lot about adaptive teaching and what we do is for SEND students and so on. But I don't think it's necessarily the reality. And we've had a really interesting discussion this morning about the fact that our initial teacher education program in the UK looks like it's becoming increasingly prescribed. So I would say that here there are some aspects that feel a little bit more open, but I feel like they're shutting down. So I'm not sure where you'd find somewhere which is truly democratic. That's a long search. I don't know what Sally thinks, but that's sort of my view, is that actually the more that they try to improve our education system is the more that they then tell us what to do. And I think there are, I mean, I'm looking at a sort of similar aspect of risk, but I'm finding that teachers are actually shutting down their different ways of teaching in order to cope with the various pressures that are put upon them from the government. So even though the literature suggests that we do focus on more liberal aspects, in reality, we don't. Maybe somebody's got a more positive answer.
Yeah, let's go to Jonathan and then back to the chat for another question.
Yeah, just I guess I'd pick up on that point that Karen made. Yeah, the English system, and it's worth bearing in mind that the system in the UK is not monolithic. The Scottish system, the Welsh system, the Northern Irish system are also different. But the English system certainly, I would probably agree with that, having worked in teacher education as well. I guess I would look at some of those examples in Scandinavia, possibly Finland, and there, although I think they're often sort of held up as this sort of ideal, which when you probably get into the granular things aren't maybe as perfect as people might assume. But I guess there are two things that I think are maybe important, and I really liked, Priscilla, your dimensions in terms of the, I guess, micro-political and the ethical and the epistemic as being kind of three lenses or ways to think about the practices in the classroom. And I suppose I was thinking as you were talking about the political, but with the kind of capital P, you know, those government policies which create and frame the conditions in which teacher education and education more generally happens, that allows, I suppose, teachers and schools to operate in such a way. And I agree with Karen that in England it's been closed down, and we're seeing more and more kind of centralization of teacher education with the core content framework and things. And then the other dimension is then the idea around like the autonomy of teachers. And again, I think in Scandinavia, there's a greater element where teachers are treated as professionals, and therefore they can make those micro-political decisions more easily, perhaps, and they have more scope for the kind of the ethical and the epistemic disruption almost. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't offer any good solution. It was a good question from Camilla. But yeah, I guess there are examples where governments might create the conditions where those things happen better, and they treat teachers as professionals such that they can kind of engage in these kind of dimensions you've talked about.
Before we come to the question in the chat, I'll just bring in the Scottish context, because as Jonathan said, it's different. And when I got my job in Lancaster, people said, well, when are you moving down? And I said, why would I take my children out of the Scottish education system and put them in Michael Gove's? And they would just look, oh yeah, right, you know, of course not. So, you know, we've had the curriculum for excellence for some time. And I think as a concept, it was a progressive thing. And definitely the idea that learning happens at different paces and in different ways. And certainly at the primary level, it allowed a lot more scope. And we certainly didn't have the same standardized testing. But one of the things is I'm not a teacher educator, but I worked in a school of education. And I found that the academics teaching the students took an incredibly political view of the curriculum for excellence and talked it down, because basically they didn't like the SNP government. I mean, in Scotland, it all comes down to that. And so the teachers, I think, had a real chance to grab some agency and even to grab more than what those who framed the curriculum were offering. But they sort of self-limited, and their teachers limited them by saying, oh, don't trust this. So it's a very, very strange situation. That said, I still think at the end of the day, it's a better system than south of the border. I think I'm lucky to have had my children there, but it's far from perfect. So there's lessons to be learned. Now let me go to Kai. I'm sorry if I've pronounced your name wrongly. I'm very bad with names. Do you want me to ask your question, or do you want to come in?
Hello, Jen. Thank you so much. I'll read out my questions.
Great.
But before reading out my questions, I would like to contribute to the previous question about the critical education in different countries, since I did my PhD study in the US, and I keep following some of the milestones development of the teacher education in the US. Now, the latest news is that, you know, some of the states curriculum had been banning the critical race theory books on racial lens and studies, you know, throughout their history from the right forces or conservative forces. And so it's a milestone event in the US at present. So it's going backwards, we can say, at least. And College Board, which has been managing the AB courses, had been canceling out the materials on teaching about African American studies for starting big chunk for critical studies. So this relates to teacher education there, update on that side, as far as I know. Okay, that said, my question, Priscilla, is really excellent talk, and thank you very much for this. But I would like to know more about the educational programs, teacher educational programs' role in teachers' understanding of themselves in dealing with their school, or in describing these tension description. Because my assumption is that the teachers' education program and the documents you analyzed in your study might have been shaping their understanding of their positions. Thank you so much, Priscilla.
Okay.
Thank you, Tom.
Related with how they understand the teacher education. And I'm so sorry, Kwai, but I'm trying to understand the question. If you can rephrase them, I'm reading it here.
Yes, Priscilla.
But could you please elaborate more about the role of the teacher?
Because in your
okay, yeah.
Sorry, would I need to? So in your data collection, I understand is you collected the documents of the programs.
Okay.
So you can relate it with that.
Yes.
Least,
I will. Yes. I haven't done yet the relation between the documents, the interview to directors of initial teacher formation programs, and the information I've collected from novice teachers, which are critical incidents and semi-structured interviews. So I have to cross these 4 different instruments, the information, right, compiled from these different instruments in order to say something about initial teacher formation programs. So I can't give any information yet because I haven't done that process yet.
Okay, thank you, Priscilla.
Yeah, my idea, just to complement, my idea is to see, for example, if there is any correspondence in this lack of critical vision of novice teachers, for example, the lack of pedagogical agency and the lack of the absence of mention, these kind of things in the documents or the explanations that directors of initial teacher formations programs can say about it, but I haven't done that analysis yet. For another talk.
Okay, got it. Yes, that's great. That's great.
I think you've just volunteered for a follow-up talk.
Yes,
later in the research as it's coming to its conclusion. And Sally's made a note here that, of course, in England there's different routes into teaching. So you know that's another thing to consider. So are there any other questions? Maybe again, I think just then we were touching on Priscilla was explaining an aspect of the methodology of her study, which is very multidimensional. Any questions on that or anything else? Or any final observations? Okay, well, I think we've had a really rich discussion, and you can see, Priscilla, from the engagement how many people are wanting to have conversations about the sort of work you're doing, which is really, really good to know. And, you know, you can see that in terms of going on to publish and taking this work to a broader audience. I personally want to observe that, you know, at the start, I thought, my gosh, she's trying to do so much. You know, this is vast. How is it ever going to come together? And it is coming together. It is an amazing thing to see this happen, and the ambition of your study is something that really to commend. So thank you so much, Priscilla, for coming and talking to us. We really enjoyed that, and actually do hope that we can get part 2, or we can think about maybe some other sort of format, given this is clearly something that maybe we have quite a few of our doctoral students who are interested in this area. So let's maybe think on that. Before we close, let me thank Dee, Rebecca and Jonathan for all the work they do behind the scenes that make our seminars run so smoothly. This will be available to watch again, listen again on our website in a couple of weeks. I do apologise that we've had sound issues today. I think there's been a number of causes. There's gales where I am, so that may be doing things to the sound. So I apologise for that. And I'd like to invite you to come to our next seminar, which is on Wednesday, the 1st of March. And we'll have Murray Saunders, long-standing professor in our department, and he'll be joined by John McGovern, who is a higher education consultant. And their talk is Higher Education as a Soft Power Mechanism, using a practice-based realist approach to evaluative inquiry. So there's quite an interesting thing following on from Priscilla, this idea of the soft power at work in what we're doing. So may I thank you all and thank Priscilla, and look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you very
everyone.
much. Bye.
Thanks. Well done, Priscilla.
Priscilla will save the chat
Thank
so
you.
that you can see the very interesting comments and questions.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.